You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. It's time for part 2, the final part, of this short series on Jake Hebert. When last we left off, Jake was pretending that there's evidence for a global flood on Earth, while both saying that geologists can recognize such floods, and that they can't. It was very confusing. Anyway, here he's going to tell us about fossils.
And within those sedimentary rocks are the fossilized remains of billions of plants and animals.
It's actually more like many trillions of organisms, far more than could possibly be alive over the course of 1 year. If you were to bring all the fossils on Earth back to life over the course of a year, the planet would be many meters thick in solid plant and animal mass. And that's to say nothing of the microbes which would form their own oceans of just solid microbe.
That had to have been rapidly buried in order to fossilize.
Rapidly here simply means that the decay rate is slower than the deposition rate. While this does not happen everywhere, it is also not so rare as to be unheard of. Bogs are definitionally such areas where the accumulation of organic, mostly plant matter, is faster than the decay rate, which is why bog mummies are a thing. They're on their way to being fossils. Similarly, anoxic lagoons are another place where this routinely occurs. Of course, mudslides, landslides, sand dune collapses, and slumps of ocean muck can also make this happen. It's just a fact that while most animals and plants won't be fossilized, the things that cause them to be fossilized are still happening all over the place, and there are fossils forming now.
So these rocks in the Grand Canyon, those are water-deposited rocks.
Aw, except for that coconino sandstone, that's wind deposited. Whoops. Also, of course, with the possible exception of the Surprise Canyon conglomerate, none of the other rocks in the Grand Canyon are flood rocks either, because remember, floods can't produce every kind of rock. Instead, the rocks of the Grand Canyon have things like centuries worth of tidal cross-bedding, low-energy deposition in fluvial fans, braided channel deposition, etc. Now, if creationists want to say that all those kinds of rocks can be deposited by floods, I eagerly await their sedimentation experiments, because the real geologists have already done theirs.
And we are arguing that these are from the Genesis flood.
How about just starting with arguing that they're from a flood at all, and once that's established, then trying to figure out how it could all be the same single flood?
Baby steps. Baby steps. Baby steps.
So if those rocks and fossils really were formed during the Genesis flood 4,500 years ago,
That's one arc-sized if.
well, where is the evidence for millions of years?
Deposition rates, radiometric dating, genetics, astronomy, thermoluminescence, electron spin resonance, thermodynamics, like basically most of science that has anything to do with life, the universe, or rocks.
Okay, it's not there.
Once again, we get a creationist tautology. If we're right, then we're right. Okay, that's true. Problem is that there's no evidence you are right. So where does that leave us? Oh, right, with the actual literal physical mountains that preclude young Earth creationism. Like El Capitan in Texas. Or, just all of the Himalayas.
We're claiming that these rocks and fossils are not evidence for millions of years. They're evidence for the flood.
Yes, and Scientologists are claiming that the universe is trillions of years old, and that you're infected with the ghosts of long-dead aliens who were killed because they went in for tax audits. Not sure why I should take either seriously, since both are exactly as well evidenced and exactly as plausible as each other.
Furthermore, we have evidence that the Earth is young, and I'm just going to focus on one particular example here, and that's the Earth's magnetic field.
I'm sensing more Humphreys coming.
Secular scientists have admitted they have no idea how the Earth's magnetic field could be sustained for billions of years. Now, they have a theory that they call the dynamo theory.
Now, bakers will tell you that they have no idea how bread could possibly rise. Now, they have a theory called the yeast metabolic theory, but they have no idea.
They've been working on it for 100 years and still haven't been able to get it to work.
Now, bakers have been working on this theory for thousands of years, but they still don't know everything about the metabolism of yeast, so they haven't really been able to get this theory to work.
And this scientist here, not just 6 years ago, said, look, we don't understand how the Earth's magnetic field has lasted for billions of years. We have less of an understanding now than we thought we had a decade ago.
Once again, with the weird, not from an actual paper, out of context quote. So to the surprise of no one but creationists, this quote is part of the article meant to set up the problem for which the solution will be proposed. Let's read some more of the article and see what's going on. The work, showing that the liquid core transfers more heat than previously thought, has gained wide acceptance since its publication in Nature 2 years ago, especially since their first principle calculations now have some experimental backing. A team of Japanese researchers recently found that small samples of iron, when subjected to high pressures in the laboratory, displayed the same heat transfer properties that Alfei and his colleagues predicted. Stevenson, the Caltech's geophysicist, says that the new values for liquid iron's conductivity will probably stand the test of time. It's possible that the numbers might come down a little bit, but I'd be surprised to see them come all the way down to the conventional value, he says. So how can the new findings be reconciled with the undeniable existence of the planet's magnetic field? Stevenson and other researchers have previously proposed a second mechanism besides heat flow that could produce the required convection to the outer core. The inner core, although composed almost entirely of pure iron, is thought to contain traces of lighter elements, primarily oxygen and silicon. As the iron in the inner core cools and solidifies, the researchers hypothesize, some of those light elements would be squeezed out, like the salt extruded from ice crystals when seawater freezes. Those light elements would then rise to the liquid outer core, creating convection currents. The so-called compositional convection would be another way to power the geodynamo. But compositional convection would work only once an inner core had already formed. In a purely liquid core, the light elements would be evenly distributed throughout the liquid, so there would be no compositional convection. Based on how fast Earth's core is cooling and solidifying now, it's likely that the inner core formed relatively recently, perhaps within the last billion years. How did the geodynamo manage to function for at least a couple billion years before the inner core existed? The problem is actually in Earth's past, not in the present, says Alfei. This is where new hypotheses are coming in. Some people are saying that maybe Earth was a lot hotter in the past. If the young Earth contained more heat than current theories account for, there might have been enough left over to power the requisite convection, even given the new findings about liquid iron's higher conductivity. What could have provided the extra heat? One of the leading explanations would have beggared the imaginations of even the most inventive medieval mapmakers. Primordial collisions between the young Earth and other protoplanets forced mantle material into the core, providing the heat that kick-started Earth's geodynamo. The idea that a Mars-sized body smashed into Earth roughly 4.5 billion years ago was first proposed in the 1970s in an effort to explain the uncanny resemblance of moon rocks to terrestrial ones. Moon rocks are unique in that regard. Meteorites, for example, have chemical and elemental profiles that mark them as distinctly otherworldly. But rocks from the moon and the Earth look identical, says Buffett. Were it not for that store of excess heat, Earth's geodynamo might have never started, and without a protective magnetic field around the planet, solar radiation would have stripped Earth's atmosphere and bombarded the surface, which was apparently the fate of Mars. It may be that several seemingly disparate phenomena were essential in making Earth a habitable world: the formation of the moon, the planetary magnetic field, plate tectonics, and the presence of water. Without the collision that created the moon, there wouldn't have been enough heat for the convection to start in Earth's core and power the magnetic field. Without water, Earth's crust might have remained too strong to be broken up into tectonic plates, and without a tectonically fractured crust, too much heat would have been trapped inside Earth. Without Earth being able to cool, there would have been no convection and no conduction. So, yeah, the solution is the same as the solution to the question of where the moon came from. The Earth needs to have more heat than what is expected, and there's an obvious source of such heat: a major interplanetary collision.
It's even worse than that, because if you look at measurements of the strength of the magnetic field that have been made within the last 150 years or so.
Well, hey, those are the measurements I already talked about with Humphreys. And like I said before, the long-term decay of Earth's magnetic field has already been falsified by paleomagnetism, in which we can see the strength and direction of Earth's magnetic field in the rocks that formed at various points in Earth's history. And spoiler, the field strength hasn't been decaying all that time, even though it kinda has been for 150 years or so. As a result of having already addressed this, I'm skipping the rest of it.
By the way, Russ Humphreys also predicted that volcanic rocks would show evidence of rapid magnetic reversals. We think those were triggered by the flood.
No, he didn't. That discovery was made in 1906 in France. Russell Humphreys was born in 1942. That's like someone born in 1975 saying that they predicted the start of World War II. Instead, what happened is that Humphreys just made his model compatible with magnetic field reversals, even though his idea of the origin of magnetic fields of the solar system, starting as a result of aligned water molecules, doesn't really allow for that. But you can shove all sorts of magical shit into the flood for no reason.
And sure enough, he predicted this in 1986. And
wow, he predicted it only 77 years after it was discovered that Earth's magnetic field had reversed, and 23 years after the reversals at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge were discovered. That's amazing! Who knew that Humphreys also invented a time machine? Now, you'd think that he could instead use it to just film the real ark or Jesus' resurrection or something. Instead, I guess he just uses it to turn what would otherwise seem like just him using post hoc magical thinking into predictions of things that were already known by the time he talked about them. How am I supposed to take this seriously?
there was a paper published in 1989 where they found evidence of these rapid magnetic reversals.
Let's read that title. Evidence suggesting extremely rapid field variation during a geomagnetic reversal. That's not a paper reporting rapid magnetic reversals. That's a paper saying that during a particular magnetic reversal, the Earth's magnetic field went a bit crazy. The title of this paper says that Jake isn't being honest with it. How much more blatant can you even get?
Happening in days, okay? And that was shocking to secular scientists.
Oh look, another paper title that shows this is just bullshit. This one is New Evidence for Extraordinarily Rapid Change in the Geomagnetic Field During a Reversal. In other words, when a reversal happens, it doesn't take long. Not that there were rapid reversals in succession. If I tell you that a car crash happens in less than a second, and say that there have been 60 car crashes in the history of a particular road, that doesn't mean that they all happen in the space of less than a single minute. It just means that when they did happen, they were rapid. And the fact that they were identified as rapid is actually reliant on the ability of the scientists who did these studies to differentiate different timescales in the rocks, meaning that in order to even accept these studies in the first place, one has to be able to trust their dating techniques, and guess what? Those dating techniques say that the Earth is billions, not thousands of years old.
And that was confirmed. There was another paper published in 1995, and others have also confirmed this as well. And that was a totally shocking idea for the secular scientists.
Maybe it was. I don't care. It doesn't help support a young Earth. And Forehead here had to lie about it to pretend it did.
Well, we're going to move on now to our nearest neighbor in space, and that's the moon. And evolutionary scientists have a very hard time explaining the moon's existence.
That's odd because Jake here already cited an article that went into how the moon came to be. You don't think he'd have cited it without actually reading it, do you? That would be dishonest of him. And I'm told that I should accuse creationists of dishonesty less. So tell me in the comments how you think he managed to cite an article in which the impact hypothesis for the origin of the moon was a major part of the body of the text, without noticing that it is in fact that major part of the text.
In fact, one Harvard astrophysicist is reported to have joked,
Nope, we are not listening to an alleged joke Erwin Shapiro, the name he later attributes it to, who may or may not have ever even said it, on the basis of hearsay. Citations or STFU?
but there's lots of evidence that the moon is young. There is evidence of recent geological activity. There are these embankments called scarps on the moon that are a clue that the moon has recently cooled off and the crust has actually shrunken a little bit.
So I wasn't aware of this, but now I am, since I can do this thing that creationists tend not to do. Read the actual paper. So this discovery was described in Evidence of Recent Thrust Faulting on the Moon, revealed by Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter Camera by Thomas R. Waters et al., published in Science on the 20th of August 2010. These, as Jake stated, are from thermal contraction as the moon's interior cools off. Now, both Jake and the researchers call these scarps young, but what does that mean? Well, the authors estimate somewhere around a maximum of 800 million years, and more likely 50 million years, whereas Jake means less than 6,000 years. So how did the researchers come up with this age? Well, first they note that the scarps are still relatively uneroded, and you might wonder how could that be the case after 50 million years, and the answer is simply that there's no wind or water on the moon, so erosion is extremely slow, although it does happen. Another thing they note is what size of crater the scarps bisect versus what size crater is overlaid on top of the scarps. Because if the scarp bisects the crater, it must be younger than the crater. Whereas if the crater instead overlays the scarp must be older than the crater. The thing is that the erosion rate on the moon can be pretty well measured, and it doesn't help the young Earthers. And the age as determined by the craters is based on models of the age and development of the solar system, which are based on its great age. Which means that Jake here is basing his statement that these are young scarps on the basis of models of the formation of the solar system that require it to be billions of years old. Further, both main thermodynamic models of the moon's history predict the formation of such scarps late in the history of the moon. In fact, it's possible there will be future episodes of scarp formation, and that we might even be around to see it. Just don't hold your breath for it. So this is just another example of the fact that old objects can have new features, without that meaning that the object is only as old as its youngest feature. But combined with the fact that this is a confirmed prediction of the great age of the moon, and the fact that the only reason these scarps are identified as young is the models based on the great age of the moon overall, I'm going to go ahead here and say that Jake doesn't know what he's talking about at best, and at worst, well, you know. If you want to check the paper, it's linked in the description, but it's behind a paywall, and I have to remind you, no matter how tempting it might be, do not go to scihub.se to get around that paywall. Remember, the place not to go is sci-hub.se. Don't do it.
Moreover, there's evidence that geological activity is very likely still going on. There are things called transient lunar phenomena where you will sometimes see flashes of light on the moon, hazes, colors, and some of those are meteorite impacts, but some of those could be evidence of ongoing volcanic activity on the moon.
Note that geological activity isn't synonymous with volcanic activity. Volcanic activity is a subset of geological activity, which also includes global scale contraction, which was what caused the aforementioned scarps, quakes, and uplifts, none of which are volcanic. So we know for certain that the moon is geologically active in the broad sense, because there are moonquakes that we can detect with seismic monitors that have been placed on the moon, because yes, humans have been to the moon. But in order to claim that there are active volcanoes on the moon, we need to see some evidence of that, and it really shouldn't be too hard to find. In the wake of one of those transient events, just check. Is there a new crater? And if so, is it surrounded by debris consistent with a volcano, or with an impact? They aren't the same debris. Odd that no one has come out with evidence of a recent volcano on the moon itself, then, isn't it? Given that according to what Jake is saying here, volcanoes are erupting on the moon all the time.
And there's evidence that the moon is experiencing moonquakes.
Oh hey, I just mentioned that. Neat.
Even in the recent past. And this completely shocked the secular scientist. Because basically that would imply that the moon still has enough energy to drive this geological activity, and they were thinking the moon should have cooled off billions of years ago.
What does cooled off in this context mean? Does it mean that the moon should have reached a thermodynamic equilibrium so that its interior and exterior are the same temperatures minus heat from external sources like solar radiation? Well, that's not what any model says. But also, let's look at that quotation, because anytime a creationist gives a quotation from some scientist implying that creationism might be right, you should check. Because it's basically a guarantee that the scientist does not think that, and that the quote was taken out of context. And what do you know, but that the article, which again is linked, in fact found that the moonquakes were associated with those scarps, and peak when tidal stress on the moon is at a peak. You know, the same thing that powers geological activity on Io, although here it's far less spectacular.
And so for a long time it was settled science, quote unquote, that the moon had been geologically dead for the last 3 billion years. We now know that's not true.
And have even confirmed predictions about tectonic activity based on better models of the moon's thermodynamic history, which again, rely on the great age of the moon to make sense. Hebert is just complaining that models in science are modified or overturned when new data comes in, ironically while arguing that models should be overturned on the basis of new data. He's trying to have his Glorios and eat them too.
Conquering the Beta Quadrant is hungry work. When you need power to keep destroying the enemies of the Empire, eat Glorios, made with real Borath chocolate, fresh tart milk, and sugar crystals. Glorios are the snack you need to fight for glory for you and your house. Double stuffed now available. Glorios.
Furthermore, there's evidence that the moon had a strong magnetic field in the past, and it's even harder for secular scientists to explain that than it is to explain the magnetism on Earth. And one of the reasons for that is because the moon rotates so slowly. It takes a whole month to spin once on its axis.
I mean, it should have had a fairly strong magnetic field when it was younger, because it would have been hotter, but I noticed that he doesn't mention how strong the field is now, why it's too strong, or not strong enough, or cite anything at all. So this isn't an argument, it's just a statement that some nebulous they think the moon should have had a magnetic field, which
Okay.
So now we're going to go to the red planet, Mars. And secular scientists want very much to find evidence of life on Mars. They think this will make the evolutionary story seem more plausible.
Okay, scientists aren't out there trying to demonstrate the truth of evolution. As far as basically all of them are concerned, that's already done. This is just like when flat earthers complain that NASA isn't doing what they want them to do in order to show that the Earth isn't flat. But they're not, because NASA doesn't need to show that the Earth is round. No one who is taken seriously in science in relevant fields doubt either the basics of the globe or evolution. Similarly, astronomers aren't out there trying to prove gravity, chemists aren't out there trying to prove the oxygen theory of fire, and doctors aren't out there trying to prove the germ theory of disease. Sure, there are weirdos who will reject any given part of science, But that doesn't make things as well established as evolution something that suddenly needs whole studies on its plausibility. The reason scientists would like to find evidence of life on Mars is that it would tell us more about the history of life, as well as help answer some questions about the origin of life. But it's not going to do a single thing to change the plausibility or probability of humans and chimpanzees sharing a common ancestor with each other.
They haven't found it, and I don't think they're going to, especially intelligent life. I don't think there's any chance of that.
No one else is expecting intelligent life there either, unless of course it's actually the Prothean ruins which will unlock the secrets of Element Zero.
But they want to find life desperately.
Nope, it's not desperate. It would be cool. Personally, I don't think it'll happen because I tend to favor the rare Earth hypothesis. But part of that is just me being pessimistic, so I'm not disappointed each time it's not aliens, because
It's never aliens.
If they can't find life, they want to find water because they think water, if you get water, supposedly that shows life can evolve.
water has already been found on Mars, both in the present and unmistakable evidence of it in the past. In fact, the core of both the northern and southern ice caps on Mars are water ice.
But there's evidence of catastrophic flooding on Mars. Now, today, there's not a drop of liquid water on the Martian surface.
That's true.
But they're okay with the idea of catastrophic flooding, and creationists are too. We just think it's a little ironic that we live on a water world where there's all this water and we have all these water-deposited rocks, and they will tell you there's no evidence for a worldwide flood.
In fact, there is counter-evidence, but I've already gone over that a lot.
We think that's a little bit inconsistent.
This is like someone telling me that their house was hit by an earthquake and then not believing that mine wasn't. Just because we both have Earth around us. And Earth is the thing that quakes. Sure, I might live hundreds of kilometers from the nearest fault line, in an area with no known history of earthquakes, and of course my house is pretty darn intact, but I guess I'm just being inconsistent by rejecting the earthquake hypothesis for my house, but not necessarily for the house of the person who told me about their earthquake. And of course it's even worse because he's comparing a non-global flood or series of floods with clear evidence on Mars to a global flood with no evidence and plenty of counter-evidence on Earth. At least my example was apples to apples. He's comparing apples to, pears, which are related to apples, but clearly aren't the same thing.
By the way, Russ Humphreys made another prediction. He predicted that older volcanic rocks on Mars should have evidence of past magnetism, and sure enough, that was confirmed. You've got these craters in the southern hemisphere where you've got magnetic fields that have been preserved. Again, we don't accept those age assignments of billions of years, but these are rocks that are presumably older on Mars, and they have that remnant of magnetism that Russ Humphreys predicted.
But that's also a prediction of the standard models of the formation of the solar system, which would result in early Mars having a magnetosphere created by the dynamo of its still molten core. Since both science and magic magnet water predict that early Mars should have magnetism, and since basic physics says that iron-heavy rocks should have their magnetic field aligned with the magnetosphere as they cool from lava, this is not something we can use to discriminate between the models, and so it's not evidence for the magic magnetic water hypothesis.
So now we're going to head on to the outer gas giants. And of course, we have Jupiter, that's well known for its size and its great red spot. Jupiter gives off twice as much energy as it receives from the sun.
It sure does.
And so it's like a potato that you've taken out of the microwave. It's cooling off. It's losing energy. It's relatively warm. I mean, these are still cold temperatures according to our everyday experience, but it's relatively warm. And that's hard to explain if you think this thing is really billions of years old.
Why?
Now, secular scientists are aware of this. They've come up with different ideas to try to explain this, but there's problems with all of them. The simplest explanation is that Jupiter is simply young. It's still cooling off from the energy, it's still losing that energy that God gave it at creation.
Or it's old and still losing energy. In order for this argument to work, Jake would need to show that the maximum energy that Jupiter contained at formation, according to conventional models, was too low for it to still be at thermodynamic disequilibrium with its surroundings, ignoring energy from the sun, or at least at the point where the energy loss from the disequilibrium must be smaller than the energy gained from the sun. Not even the much smaller Earth is in thermodynamic equilibrium with the sun. If the sun were to disappear entirely, Earth would still be hotter than the temperature of the microwave background radiation, which puts sort of a floor on how cold objects in space can get. We can tell because Earth still has volcanoes and a molten core. If Earth were to be the same size and composition but far enough away from the sun, it too would give off more heat than it absorbed from the sun. Jupiter would have started with much more energy, and given that it has much more volume compared to surface area, because that's how surface area and volume work, it would lose its energy at a slower rate than Earth, percentage-wise. So without even needing to do math, just a quick sanity check, we can tell that there's no way that Jupiter should be at thermodynamic equilibrium with the surrounding space minus the energy from the sun. Then the only thing left is that Jupiter is at a distance where what energy it does get from the sun is lower than the energy it loses from internal sources. Now, every body that is currently losing energy to the environment, ignoring the sun, has a distance from the sun at which the energy loss is higher than the energy received from the sun, because that's just a mathematical certainty given the inverse square law that governs energy from the sun received at various distances. That Jupiter happens to be at such a distance isn't very surprising, nor does it really demand some special explanation. At one point the Earth too was shedding more heat than it received from the sun, and now it's not. That Jupiter, which is much bigger and had much more energy to start with, and can't release energy as fast per unit volume, and is much, much farther from the sun, isn't at that point, is just a thing that's true. It's not a problem for any scientific model.
Now, Io is the most volcanically active body in the solar system, and it's a small body, okay? It takes energy to drive that volcanism. The question is, how can it have maintained that energy for billions of years? Now, the story there is a mechanism that secular scientists will invoke to explain this. It's something called tidal flexing.
Indeed, and I'm sure that if Jake wants to dispute it, he'll at least cite something that did the math to show that tidal flexing simply can't work, because it won't produce enough heat, right? He won't simply use "nuh-uh" as his argument, will he?
Where you have these gravitational tugs that can stretch and compress the crust, warming it up.
It's not just the crust, it's the whole body, core and all. It's all affected by gravity, so it's all affected by tidal forces.
But it's not clear that that's enough to do it. Maybe it is, maybe it's not.
Gee, I wish we had a single reason other than some anti-science nutbag saying maybe not to actually be skeptical of tidal heating as the source for Io's volcanism. So far, though, we don't.
But also, the rate of the volcanism is so high that if the volcanism were going on at just 10% of the rate that it is today, over geological time, the entire mass of the planet would have been erupted or 40 times. Okay, that's
yeah. And what's the problem?
That's kind of stretches credulity there.
Does it? Insect-eating bats eat about half their body weight each night. Most bats die before they hit 20, so let's say 15 years is a good estimate for how long they live. So we take 365.25 and multiply it by 15, then divide that by 2. We get that a normal bat will in its life eat 2,739 times its own mass. I don't know, kind of stretches credulity. I think maybe bats just don't exist.
Okay. Now, there's another moon, one of the other Galilean moons is Ganymede, and it's got a magnetic field, and that too is a surprise for secular scientists because, again, it's small. It should have cooled off billions of years ago, so you shouldn't have a magnetic field.
Once again, the scientific explanation is tidal heating keeping the core hot. If Jake has a counter to this point beyond simple personal incredulity, he should probably have presented it. He is aware that there are sources of heat beyond the latent heat of gravitational collapse, right?
And the tidal flexing argument doesn't work as well in this case because Ganymede is farther away from Jupiter.
Yeah, it is, which probably explains why it's less tectonically active than Io. Kind of like we might expect.
So if it's billions of years old, its magnetic field should have disappeared long ago, but it could still have a magnetic field if it's just 6,000 years old.
Or maybe it's being heated, which, we know for a fact that it is. Setting up false dichotomies only work when people don't notice. Unfortunately for Jake, I noticed.
Well, now we're heading on to Saturn, which is renowned for its beautiful rings.
Let me guess, the rings can't be 4 billion years old, so neither can Saturn, even though that's not how anything works.
And those rings actually show indications of youth. Those rings are made up of these icy particles, and those particles are being constantly bombarded by space dust and micrometeorites. And so they ought to be dark and sooty after billions of years, but they're not. They're very bright and shiny. And so even the secular scientists have been forced to acknowledge that these rings are relatively young. Now, they will still say they're hundreds of millions of years old.
Right, so the actual scientists who look at the actual data conclude that these things are far older than Jake thinks the universe is. But because they're not as old as something else, that means the universe is young. Okay, let's try this. Globe Earth cartographers say that Anchorage, Alaska is like 6,000 kilometers from me. But those same people say that the distance to Flagstaff is only 400 kilometers. As a result, I now contend that in fact Anchorage is actually 8 meters from me. So, inside my house. That's the level of dumb we're working with here.
But that's an upper limit. They can't be older than that. Now, could they be younger? Could they be just 6,000 years old? Yes. And so that's another indication of youth that we see inside the solar system.
Yes, but not an indication of the youth of the solar system. Look at this. This is a baby. It's an indication of youth in humanity. Now, quick, how long have humans been around on the basis of the fact that a baby exists? Oh, it doesn't work that way now, does it?
We can also go to one of Saturn's moons, that's Titan. It's unusual in that it has an atmosphere, and there's some methane in this atmosphere. Now, that methane is being broken down by solar radiation, and there's no evidence that it's being replenished. And that puts an upper limit of somewhere between 10 and 100 million years on the atmosphere of Titan.
Or that itself is evidence that it's being replenished, since everything we know about the solar system indicates that it's about 4.5 billion years old. One unexplained chemical process on Titan is not enough to counter that. You need to show that there is no mechanism for the formation of atmospheric methane, not just that you don't know what the mechanism is. Until that's done, it's just a mystery, not a contradiction.
Okay, that's an upper limit. Could it be younger than this? Yes.
Could it be made of unicorn turds? Yes. Oh, you think it's mostly made of water, ice, and simple hydrocarbons. What do you think unicorns poop out? Anything could be anything when you invoke an all-powerful agent. The question is, do you have any reason to doubt the standard explanation? And so far, there isn't one. So sure, go off and believe whatever you want. Just don't pretend that the evidence supports you. Like, seriously, I have no beef with someone who would say, like Todd Woods tends to say, that the evidence currently supports the standard scientific models and not young Earth creationism, but who says that he believes for non-evidential reasons and who thinks that maybe he can find some evidence for his beliefs. You know what, Todd? Good luck to you. That's not being dishonest with the data. What Jake is doing is being dishonest about the data.
Yes, it could.
Is such a thing even possible? Yes, it is.
So again, practically everywhere we look in the solar system, we see these indications of youth.
Man, everywhere I look in human societies, I see babies. I guess humanity is only as old as the youngest baby.
Now we go to Uranus. And Uranus is unusual in that it's tilted sideways. The other planets spin like tops. Uranus rolls along like a wheel.
That would imply that its rotational axis is a constant angle relative to the normal direction of the orbit. That is, that it precesses 360 degrees per orbit. That is not the case. The axis of Uranus is relatively fixed like that of the other planets. It's just that the angle relative to the plane of its orbit is close to 90 degrees.
And that's an apparent problem for this nebular hypothesis.
Is it a problem like Venus was a problem, in that it's only a problem if you don't understand physics, like Jake, the physicist Hebert, doesn't?
Now, to be fair, there was a paper published this year where they claimed that they could explain this with meteorite impacts or impact events. I find that a little hard to believe because it's not just the planet that's tilted sideways. The rings are as well, and so are these moons. I'll admit I haven't looked at their code that they use to do their calculations, but I'm skeptical that would work.
In other words, well, I haven't looked at the data, but I'm not buying it. Once again, just incredulity. That's not an argument. And the fact that this man has a PhD in physics and is using arguments from incredulity is pretty telling. He could actually do the work and show why it doesn't work, or why it does, but instead we just get, well, that would make my beliefs wrong, so nuh-uh.
But we also see evidence of youth in Uranus. Back in, again, 1984, Russ Humphreys predicted...
Remember that one of Russ Humphreys' factors in his predictions was unconstrained between 0 and 1. So he predicted just about every value physically possible in all worlds.
A particular value for this magnetic moment, that little squiggly sign means about, because we didn't have enough information to make predict a number that was more precise than that.
Yes, he made a prediction of the order of magnitude. But remember, he also predicted most other possible answers, because again, his prediction was basically unconstrained. Also, he got the answer wrong for Jupiter anyway. His predictions were basically that planets should have magnetospheres that are in proportion to their mass, which isn't really the worst guess, and is basically what you'd estimate if you had literally nothing else to go on. And lo and behold, that's kind of right and kind of not. So yeah, good job, Russ. You combined magical magnetic water, alchemy, and the masses of the planets, and you figured out that their magnetic fields are proportional to their mass within an order of magnitude, except when they're not. Which is also okay, because you didn't bother putting in much constraint on your magical magnetic water.
But sure enough, when Voyager 2 flew by, 2 years later, Humphreys was right. He was correct in his prediction.
Yeah, it's hard to be wrong when your prediction can be basically anything.
And Humphreys took seriously 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 5, that talks about that by the word of God the heavens were of old and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. And Russ Humphreys speculated that God made the heavenly bodies out of water, and that initially their magnetic dipole moments were all aligned. And then he made some simple assumptions, turned the crank, and was able to make these predictions.
Oh wow, cool. So if we take the Bible seriously, we can make true predictions about what we'll find out in the real world. Let's do that with oil and gas. Hey Zion Oil and Gas, how's it going? Oh, yikes.
And he did the same thing, not just for Uranus, but he did it for Neptune. Now Neptune is radiating heat, is losing energy 2.5 times faster than it's receiving it. Again, that looks like it's young. How's it managing to show this evidence of relative warmth if it's billions of years old?
Because that's how physics works. I mean, here I'll just replay the bit about Jupiter, but when I say Jupiter, just pretend I said Neptune. Or it's old and still losing energy. In order for this argument to work, Jake would need to show that the maximum energy that Jupiter contained at formation, according to conventional models, was too low for it to still be at thermodynamic disequilibrium with its surroundings, ignoring energy from the sun, or at least at the point where the energy lost from the disequilibrium must be smaller than the energy gained from the sun. Not even the much smaller Earth is in thermodynamic equilibrium with the sun. If the sun were to disappear entirely, Earth would still be hotter than the temperature of the microwave background radiation, which puts sort of a floor on how cold objects in space can get. We can tell because Earth still has volcanoes and a molten core. If Earth were to be the same size and composition but far enough away from the sun, it too would give off more heat than it absorbed from the sun. Jupiter would have started with much more energy, and given that it has much more volume compared to surface area, because that's how surface area and volume work, it would lose its energy at a slower rate than Earth, percentage-wise. So without even needing to do math, just a quick sanity check, we can tell that there's no way that Jupiter should be at thermodynamic equilibrium with the surrounding space minus the energy from the sun. Then the only thing left is that Jupiter is at a distance where what energy it does get from the sun is lower than the energy it loses from internal sources. Now, every body that is currently losing energy to the environment, ignoring the sun, has a distance from the sun at which the energy loss is higher than the energy received from the sun. Because that's just a mathematical certainty, given the inverse square law that governs energy from the sun received at various distances. That Jupiter happens to be at such a distance isn't very surprising, nor does it really demand some special explanation. At one point, the Earth too was shedding more heat than it received from the sun, and now it's not. That Jupiter, which is much bigger and had much more energy to start with, and can't release energy as fast per unit volume, and is much, much farther from the sun, isn't at that point, is just a thing that's true. It's not a problem for any scientific model.
Well, again, Russ Humphreys, he also predicted a magnetic dipole moment of Neptune, and sure enough, he got that right as well.
Again with the Humphreys predictions that he didn't really predict and that didn't work for Jupiter anyway.
Now, so how are the secular scientists doing with their predictions? Well, one physicist said this in 1989.
Oh good, I was hoping for a quote mine from more than 30 years ago.
You would have thought we would have given up guessing about planetary magnetic fields after being wrong at nearly every planet in the solar system.
And of course, this is not about the field strength, but about the field geometry, despite being used to talk about predicting field strength. The article is linked in the description, although you'll have to download a PDF since you're not allowed to dump it into Sci-Hub, since that's not kosher. I just can't believe that creationists would take a quote out of context and just lie about it. It's so weird.
So creation scientists have a far better track record on this than do secular scientists.
Yeah, so good they have to lie about it.
Russ Humphreys has made multiple successful predictions about the magnetism of these heavenly bodies.
Jake, why don't you take Humphrey's out of your mouth, since you seem to think homosexuality is a sin?
We're going to take a look at Pluto as well. It recently was demoted to a dwarf planet.
Pluto is just what they call it to keep you from discovering that it's actually Yuggoth, an outpost of the far-flung Mego civilization of fungoid crab people with wings, who are not just from beyond the solar system, but from another reality altogether.
And we learned a lot about it because of the New Horizons flyby about 5 years ago. But secular scientists were very surprised that Pluto is geologically active.
Okay.
They were shocked by that because Pluto is so tiny. It's way, 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 way far away from the sun. It's tiny. You would think it would have cooled off quickly. So why is it still geologically active?
Probably tidal action, but did any creationists say that it would be? That might be interesting.
In fact, if you look at the left lobe of the heart on Pluto, there's not a single crater there. And secular scientists think that the maximum age there is 10 million years.
Neat. Some parts of the surface of Pluto are relatively young. Of course, that doesn't really mean anything for the age of the whole thing, but that's okay as long as you don't pretend that things can only be as young as their youngest feature. That's why if you buy a new appliance for your house, it makes the whole house brand new.
They think something happened to repave that part of the planet, which I think is reasonable because even in a universe that's just thousands of years old, you might expect to see a few meteorite impacts.
Sounds like cryovolcanism to me, which is like volcanism, but it happens with water instead of lava.
The problem is, that geological activity that would be required to resurface that part of the planet takes energy. And they are they have a hard time explaining how Pluto could maintain that energy for billions of years. There was a paper they published this year that was sort of a trial balloon, but I'm not really convinced that they've got a good explanation for that. But I want to point that out just to be fair to them.
Okay, so scientists aren't sure what's heating Pluto. So we have 2 unanswered questions about the solar system so far in this talk. Therefore, we should revise the age of the solar system by a factor of 750 million. As a comparison, if I were to estimate the distance to the moon, which is conventionally thought to be 384,400 kilometers, we'd find that it's, say, 40 centimeters from the center of the Earth. That is to say, inside the Earth. Now, I might say that that's silly, but then Jake might point out, but there's a problem about some of your distance measurements. Which, yeah, there probably are, but that's not really enough for me to say that the moon, which is clearly in the sky, is actually underground. Remember, creationists are off by 9 and almost 10 orders of magnitude. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between the distance to my mouse from my hand and the distance from the Earth to the moon. And what? Titan has methane and Pluto has water volcanoes? That's what he's got to account for this so far? Oh, also, some guy made vague predictions about magical magnetic moon water.
That was inside our solar system. Let's go outside our solar system. Let's go outside our Milky Way galaxy. It's a spiral galaxy. And these spiral galaxies slowly rotate. But they don't all rotate, not all the parts of the galaxy rotate at the same speed. The parts closer to the center rotate faster than the parts that are farther out. And as a result of that, you get this winding up of the spirals, and eventually they're going to be very tightly wound, and then eventually you're not going to see any spiral structure at all. It'll just be a flat disk.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong.
Okay, so here's a basic explanation of what he's talking about. You can see what starts as just radial spokes, but it starts spinning. But the spin is faster towards the center. Now, as you can see, this means that the whole thing is basically jumbled up at the center, so it's virtually impossible to make out a spiral pattern. Eventually, this would extend to more or less the whole galaxy, making the whole thing a uniform disk. And it is true that the closer an object is to the galactic center, the faster its orbit will be. But how does this actually work in practice? Well, Jake's explanation assumes that the spiral arms are made up of a set collection of objects, but that's not how it works. In fact, they are waves, and objects come into and out of them. They are actually density waves, places where the density is higher because of a disturbance, such as a close approach of a dwarf galaxy, such as the Milky Way has in the form of the Large and Small Magellanic Clouds. In this case, the spiral arms do spin, although together as whole arms, and more slowly than anything in the galaxy, and will slowly fade away unless more disturbances cause them to form. There is no simple limit to how long a particular galaxy can maintain spiral arms. It's a function of the local gravitational situation, and in no way do spiral arms simply wind up the way Jake is describing.
So if these galaxies are around 10 billion years old, why do they look like this and not like this?
Because creationists are wrong about what spiral arms are.
Okay, that's evidence that these spiral galaxies are much younger than we're being told.
You know, as long as you ignore what spiral arms actually are.
Now, secular scientists know about this. They're working on an explanation for this. They call it the density wave model. But they've been working on it since the 1960s, and even secular scientists acknowledge there's problems with it.
Yeah, there are problems in all areas of science. That's why science isn't just over now. As long as anything remains unknown, there will be problems for science. But just because there are problems with, say, general relativity, which there are, doesn't mean that you can just pretend that GPS, which depends on our understanding of general relativity, aren't reliable. Similarly, just because there are currently problems with our understanding of galaxy formation and evolution, doesn't mean that we have warrant to just change our estimates for the age of the universe, especially when none of the problems indicate that spiral arms are actually a set collection of objects, rather than an area such objects move into and out of.
The simplest explanation for the continued existence of this spiral structure is that these galaxies are relatively young.
Yeah, that's only simple until you realize that you have to ignore basically all the rest of the data in astronomy and physics to come to that conclusion.
We're going to go ahead and take a look at something else that is of interest, and that is these hot blue stars. This particular hot blue star is one of the stars in Orion's belt.
I'm sensing another humanity can't be older than a baby as a species because babies are young type of argument.
And hot blue stars, the very hottest blue stars, they ought to burn out and explode in less than 3 million years.
Interesting then how most of them exist in star-forming regions, like in the highest density regions of spiral arms, where we also see protostars, like T Tauri stars. Weird, isn't it?
And so the obvious question is, if the universe is billions of years old, why do we still have these hot blue stars?
I don't know. Jake says that the universe is only around 6,000 years old, but dogs usually can't make it to 15, so how can the universe be any older than 15? Seems like in reality the universe is under 15 years old, and if you think it's older than that, that's just the appearance of age.
Well, secular scientists will claim that new stars are being formed, but you saw earlier that there's problems with that.
Well, actually, we saw that Jake claimed that, and that there actually wasn't anything that precluded star formation that he or his colleagues have put forward, leaving the scientific consensus unchallenged by creationists in this area, at least for the time being. Maybe creationists will finally someday find an actual problem that shows that stars can't form. But that day is not today. And I'm not going to hold my breath waiting.
Okay, the simplest explanation is that these stars are young.
Well, yeah, compared to other stars, they are young. No one is disputing this.
And so, God deserves the glory for making these beautiful stars. The Bible says He knows their number, and He has a name for every single one of them.
Cool, and I'm not here to dispute that. It just doesn't mean that science is wrong.
And He, not quote-unquote nature, deserves the glory for making this beautiful universe.
Okay, feel free not to worship nature. I don't really care.
So again, recent creation is reasonable, despite what they're going to try to make you think. You're not committing intellectual suicide by holding to a recent creation. Again, if you want a slam dunk argument from science that the universe is old or young, we can't give it to you.
We kind of can, though. I mean, just distant starlight on its own is basically evidence beyond any reasonable doubt.
But we see lots of clues that suggest that it's a lot younger than what we're being told.
If those clues are the ones presented here, then, no, there are no clues, because all that was presented here was basically bullshit.
And finally, young universe biblical assumptions has allowed Russ Humphreys, a creation physicist, to make multiple successful predictions about the magnetism of bodies in our solar system.
Jake, let me talk to you directly. Russ isn't going to date you no matter how much time you spend servicing him. He's just not into you, so you should probably give up. I know I should probably do more than just make a joke at the expense of a homophobe, but really, I've already gone into it, and there are sources in the description. We're basically at the end at this point. The whole thing is so laughable, what else can I really do?
Now, this shouldn't surprise anybody because the Lord Jesus himself implicitly affirmed recent creation.
Don't care. After this, it's more Bible verses and some ads for books. Then it's Q&A time. But unfortunately, no one bothered to give a mic to the people asking questions, so they're inaudible. Because of this is where we end it. This was a shorter series, only 2 parts, but you know, that's okay. Sometimes my 3 and 4 part series can be a bit much. Since this series is only 2 parts, don't hold your breath for a supercut. Well, if you enjoyed the video, hit like and tell me in the comments. If you didn't, feel free to hit dislike and tell me what the problem was in the comments. Either way, please remember to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon so you're always notified when I have more content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Kelvin Brostek Van Manen, Denny5252, Eleron Teller, Phil Rivara, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babby, Monkey They Them, Mrs. Spexinder, The Venerable Bede, Sphincter of Doom, and Star Runner. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.